afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the May edition of the Inspired Learning Project Chat. Hope you're doing well as we reach the end of the school year. We're excited to have you here today to hopefully offer a little bit of inspiration at what is a very busy time for all teachers and leaders at schools all across the globe. So we're excited today to have a guest with us who is doing the work that we do here at the Inspired Learning Project, and that's thinking about school aspirationally and looking to make changes in the school community, trying new things, and then sharing it out with people so we can all grow and learn from the action steps that other folks have made. Here at the Inspired Learning Project, we have monthly digital conversations. We also have a blog. Probably the most important part of what we do, though, is this chance to share messages from educators who are doing the important work to reimagine school. We're excited to have Ted McCarthy, principal of Sutton High School, with us today. And he's going to be talking about the Connections Conference and the work that he's done with his students in his community to lead the idea of social justice. So welcome, Ted.
Hi, everyone.
And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mr. Quinn.
Thanks, John. Thanks again, Ted, for being with us. Really glad to have you. I've been learning a lot from you over the last couple of years since we've been with the Inspired Learning Project. Today, we want to talk a little bit about this really incredible event that you put together called the Connections Conference. We're fortunate enough to send some students over to it, and it's just been gotten absolute rave reviews. For those who are not familiar with the Connections Conference, it is an event dedicated to working on issues connected to prejudice, bias, and privilege, with the goal of making schools a place where all students feel valued and understood. What a wonderful endeavor, Ted. So can you tell us a little bit more about Connections, the conference, and how it originated?
Sure. So our Connections group started approximately 5 years ago, I'd say. It was my second year as principal here in Sutton, and it happened, there were a couple of events that started the work for us a little bit more intentionally. We had an issue with the Confederate flag my first year here that resulted in a little bit of unrest. And then my second year here, and really what started Connections for us more intently, was I had a conversation with a student who's African American. It was not connected at all, and I did not know going into the conversation that it was going to turn in this direction. And in the middle of the conversation, he said, "Mr. McCarthy, what do you expect me to do? They use the N-word around me all the time, and they think they're my friends." And so at that point, it just kind of really put a personal story behind something that I believed for a long time, but it's hard sometimes to give it the intention that it needs. And so from that point forward, myself and a group of teachers started what was called a dialogue group. We grabbed a bunch of kids, and we had some facilitators coming from UMass. We had facilitated conversations around race and privilege in our school. But then we realized that those conversations were just happening in the room, and we really weren't doing anything with that information. So from that, the idea of a Connections group was formed. And so Connections are a group of students. Currently, we have about 40 students in Connections, although the seniors are about to graduate, so a few less, who work with our ninth graders and train them and facilitate lessons on race, bias, privilege. It's an anti-bias curriculum that our students are trained by the ADL. So the Anti-Defamation League, for those of you who don't know, they have a program called The World of Difference. They send trained facilitators to Sutton. The students participate in a 3-day, 24-hour workshop. So it's broken up by 3 days. It's a full-day program for the kids on those 3 days. And then at the end of those 3 days, the students have been trained to facilitate the work with the ninth graders. So when we first started, we were trying to do it during advisory, and it was kind of falling flat. Kids didn't want to give up their advisory time, because advisory time for us here in Sutton is a time to get some work done, to connect with teachers and so on. And to be honest, we weren't really using the language in the right way. Instead of talking about things like racism and transphobia, we were talking to kids about being good citizens and being positive members of the community. We weren't really labeling the real goals of the program. And kids saw through that, because they've been told by adults their entire lives to be good kids. And so when we started to actually more specifically and directly use the language, that's when we started getting more feedback from kids. That's when we started seeing a response that I think was equal to the goals of the program. So for the past 2 years, that's been the work we've been doing. Instead of trying to do it in advisory, the kids, the ninth graders are pulled from one class over a period of 6 weeks So instead of going to math class on one day or A block here in Sutton, instead of going to A block, they have a workshop that's facilitated by our connection students. Instead of going to B block the second week, they go to a workshop that's facilitated by our connection students and so on. And a letter goes home to the parents explaining what we're going to be doing and why we believe it's important to what we do. And obviously the parent has the option of opting out their son or daughter. So we've been doing that for 2 years. This year, we have a great group of connections kids. And just in conversations with them, myself and one of the other advisors, Colleen Maltazari, who's our world language department chair, we're talking about, wouldn't it be great if our kids could talk to other kids in other schools who are doing similar work? And we said, yeah, we could probably get something together with a couple of the Central Mass schools, and we could have them in, and we could do like a little conference. So I put out an email to the Central Mass principals that I know, and within 4 days, 5 days, I had almost every single principal saying, yes, we'd love to be a part. We'll definitely participate. So after that response, Colleen and I said, well, boy, what would happen if we actually put it out to the entire state? And within 2 weeks, we had 32 schools who were committed to sending groups of teachers and kids to the conference. So we had the participants at the conference before we actually had much of a conference. So once we had the kids and the teachers committed to go, then we did the work of lining up the speakers, keynote speaker, organizing the event. And that's really where our students came into the process. Once they knew that we were going to be hosting people from Brockton and New Bedford and Amherst and Northampton and Nipmuc and Millbury and BMR, they really were interested in what kind of workshops were going to be offered, what would the day look like for the kids, what would the day look like for the teachers, and then that work happened with the Connections group as a whole. And then the event, the Connections conference, that happened in March, I think it was March, and we had over just about 500 people here from the schools, and they participated in a day where they had different workshops to choose from, and we fed them lunch, and people left, and I think it was a good experience for all. And, you know, the goal of the conference was to get kids talking to each other about this, to have them sitting with kids from other parts of the states that they may never meet again, but having conversations about the work and why it's important in their schools and in their lives.
So Ted, first of all, I commend you, your faculty, and your students for having the courage to take on what can be really challenging conversations. I think it's a real step in leadership, and a lot to unpack within that answer. I'm curious, what do the 6 sessions look like? So let's just kind of start from the beginning. So what kind of projects or experiences do students go through through part of that 6-week course to kind of bring these issues to the surface and begin to work through some of the challenges that come out of bias, privilege, and just lack of awareness?
So one lesson builds on another, and what we're trying to do is sort of inoculate kids against some hateful or hurtful messages they might hear. We don't expect that kids are going to walk out of the 6-week program being social justice warriors and wanting to march in the streets for this work. But what we're trying to do is give them the language, expose them to concepts, and help them see right and wrong in different situations. So we start with things like implicit bias, and letting everyone know that we all have bias, and explaining that. There's a great New York Times video called Peanut Butter and Jelly. If I say peanut butter, the first word that comes to your mind is jelly. That's built up over socialization. So we use that as a sort of a launch pad to teach kids that over time we hear repeated messages, and then we have these natural biases toward different things. We talk about the difference between bias, prejudice, and racism, so the kids can see there's a difference between those 3 things. We talked to one of the activities that I really enjoy is we put up the different identities that someone might have. So race, gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, class, and we put those up on pieces of paper around the room. And then we have kids who are in small groups at this point walk around the room and tally how many members of their family would meet a criteria. So for example, if I have 1 Black person in my family, I would write down African American. And then kids can kind of visually see, well, boy, there's not a lot of racial diversity in my life or in this room. There's not a lot of religious diversity in this room. So then we started talking about, oh boy, if there's not a lot of diversity, what are you missing? What other story are you not hearing? I'm blanking on the name of the author, but there's a great TED talk. She talks about the danger of a single story, where if you get one story in your head about one group of people, then that's the only story you know. And so then the work for the remainder of the lessons is helping kids see different stories about different groups of people and then their own role and responsibility in that work. And then we end with a lesson on privilege, trying to unpack that a little bit for kids. People often think that privilege is a bad word, or that because we have privilege, that you're somehow a bad person, and we try to explain to kids that that's not the case, but that there are just certain things that you don't have to worry about, and every one of us has a different level of privilege. So a good example is, I am a straight male. I do not have to worry about being fired because of who I'm married, but in 26 states in the country, you can be fired for who you marry if you are gay. And that's news to kids. But I think sometimes when we give them specific facts like that, it can kind of make a big theoretical topic come to life.
And so moving from this 6-week course to the conference, I think is a monumental leap and a useful one, as you've seen from educators across the state. I'm curious about how you, a little bit more into a deeper dive into the structure of it. What role do the faculty play in it? What role do the students play in it? And then as administrators, both, at the building level and then district-wide, how did the Sutton community come together to put together this event?
Sure. So I'll start with the administration first. Our superintendent was incredibly supportive of the event and the idea, and was really nothing but supportive. So without him, really this kind of falls flat. I can imagine a different district with a different superintendent, this doesn't get anywhere. I am one of the advisors of the Connections group. There's myself and there's 5 other advisors. And so those are the adults that did the primary work, although we have other teachers in the building, who are not advisors to the program, but are what we'll call allies, and definitely are helpful in getting things off the ground. So the work among the adults was, divvying up the kids. My job was like, okay, which rooms are going to be used? We have some teachers with laptops, some teachers with desktops. If the presenter is coming in, we need to make sure there's a computer there for them to use, kind of the logistical stuff. Students were interested in trying to be part of different sessions based on their own interests. So we had kids signing up. There was a session on adultism, and one of our Connections kids wanted to help facilitate that lesson, that workshop. They would go to that room to sort of be the internal tech support for the presenters. So if the laptop didn't work, the student was trained to know how to get the presenter on the Wi-Fi or the network so that he could deliver the lesson. And then on the day, the kids also helped with some of the nice touches. So we had one of our students who built this beautiful mural out of different social justice posters. And so when guests came in, they stopped in front of this wall. It was probably 8 feet by 8 feet wide, and to take the picture with the signs that to sort of commemorate them being there. We had students who facilitated during lunch, who were bopping around. One of the things that I enjoyed the most about the day was the Connections kids weren't sitting together. They were intentionally jumping in with other kids from other communities to get to know them and to sort of and not to talk about, boy, what'd you think of that racism lesson? It was like, how's your soccer team doing? Where are you guys going to college? Because you have to start with a connection. You can't just jump into what are your thoughts on institutional sexism? It's not gonna fly, and it's also not gonna sound natural coming out of a 16-year-old's mouth. What we wanted the Connections kids to do was to be good ambassadors and to get kids talking, and they did a great job with that.
Marianne, you have a question for Ted.
Yeah, Ted, I'm just curious, and I know this came out of, some conversations that you had within your school community that precipitated the idea of getting these students trained in the freshman lessons, not advisory lessons, and then the Connections Conference. What have you seen as the tangible kind of results or takeaways within your school community on the day-to-day? What do you notice?
Well, I think the conversations that we started sparked a lot of work. So beyond the Connections kids in the conference, we also had our humanities teachers looking at our curriculum and seeing how different groups were represented in the curriculum. Somebody pointed out, a couple of years ago before we started this, that every time kids saw an African American, they were either a slave, poor, or an athlete. And so trying to present different stories of different groups so the kids had a wider variety. That was one thing, so the curriculum is different. One of my favorite moments of the year so far was I had one of my English teachers come down. She was teaching Raisin in the Sun, and she said, Ted, so I'm like, I have a story to play about connections. And I was like, oh. And she referenced her students. One of the connections students was in her class. And when they were talking about Raisin in the Sun, using the language of institutional racism, bias, privilege, talking in just sort of the natural conversation of class, not in a showy way, but just kind of that's because she had that language to use and bring to the table. And I think we're better off for that. I think the fact that we've been talking about these issues now for a couple of years, I think the staff are more tuned. I think in the example that I started with that student, I would bet money that a staff member heard the kids use that word. I just do. That's how I feel. And they probably didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't know, like, boy, do I address it? Does that make them, does that make the student feel more called out? Do I ignore it? Do I talk to them after class? And I think, we've done training with the staff as well, so that they're more aware and they know how to handle those situations. And I think everyone's sensitivity is heightened. And I think because of that, kids who might experience racism or intolerance are probably feel more comfortable because teachers are armed with some more language and know where we're coming from on these issues. And so they're more willing to address things head on. I think those would be the tangible outcomes of the work.
At what point, how many years of freshmen have been through that formal programming? Is this the first year? There are multiple years.
This is the formal program. This will be this ninth grade class is the second one to go through.
Okay. It'll be exciting to see kind of the impact as they all go through. And I'm assuming that the Connections Conference will iterate at some point too, and, will continue to be, wider spread and impact more of your students. How many of your own students went to the Connections Conference?
70, 65, something like that.
Okay. Was it open to everyone?
It was open-ish because we had the guests.
Sure.
Part of the power of the conference was getting 12 kids from, New Bedford and 10 kids from Amherst. That was part of the work. Mm-hmm. So we only had a certain amount of slots. But we were, the nice thing is we were able to get some middle school kids in too. There were sessions that were designed just for middle school students because some of the topics are just not, middle school kids aren't ready for that yet. Mm-hmm. So it was open, like we had like the Connections kids, and then they were basically able to invite a friend. Okay. And then those kids came, and then there were some kids who they came just kind of cold to us and said, "Hey, I heard about this thing. I want to go." If you're asking, then we'll let you in. So that was nice.
That's awesome.
And so, Ted, as a follow-up onto that, what were some of the goals or outcomes for this event? So the folks from Amherst and Bedford, we had some folks from our district come. What was the hope that they took away and for an action as a result of coming to the Connections Conference? And then, where do you see the future of this event going?
The goals, so I would say that we had two goals. Selfishly, from a Sutton perspective, we wanted our kids to feel validated in the work that they do. They give up a lot of their free time, and they do so we have advisory once a week. Some of those advisories were just like, hey, we're going to watch this video on redlining and the outcomes that has, and how does that affect what we're doing with ninth graders. So instead of having time to get their work done, they're learning about these topics. And so for our kids to give up that amount of time and spend this much effort for this work, we wanted them to feel validated and it was important and worthwhile. And when they could see that there were 500 people from all over the state coming in and engaging in the conversations, I think that validates the work for kids. It's real. It's not something that's in a textbook or an essay you have to write for college. So that's the selfish reason. The more altruistic reason I would say is that we believe strongly that more schools need to be talking about these things directly with kids. When we have the ninth grade lessons, the last thing we do is a survey with the ninth graders and say, talk to us about your time in connection. The thing that we hear over and over again is, I wish we had more of these conversations in class. And I think teachers, we're still growing in it, certainly, and I think teachers are uncomfortable having uncomfortable conversations. Mm. What if I say that was racist, am I going to be offending somebody? What if I use the wrong word? I don't know if this fits into the curriculum. And I think the conference our hope was that it would serve as a launching point for people to bring kids in to see that this work is happening, and there's a lot of interest clearly from all over the state, and then to be an inspiration to go do the work back in your own school and start small. Like the Connections Conference was 5 years in the making, from the first conversation with that student that I had to the conference in March. We didn't jump. Our first work wasn't the Connections Conference. But that's the hope, is that more schools do this intentionally at their own place, and then as we build a community, using each other as a resource. Hey, well, how are you handling this? Do you have a good lesson for that? And then it becomes a sharing network. There's a lot of things out in social media about like how to share best practice when it comes to direct instruction on writing or a math lesson or a science lab. There's not a lot of talk about this because I think teachers are understandably a little nervous about diving in, so they need some sort of platform, I feel like.
So that's a point I want to follow up on, is that there's not always the capacity amongst members of school communities to have these conversations. In addition to working with the Anti-Defamation League, do you have any other community resources that you're able to pull in, or are they able to support you beyond the conference as perhaps the conversation get a little bit more complex? Can they help you take that next step after kind of going in and exploring these issues?
So the ADL helps with the initial training, and then they provide support throughout the year as needed. They've definitely been helpful as we've grown, but a lot of the work gets done, honestly, through people here in the building who have an interest and a passion for it. Like if you're reading on the outside, if you're trying to educate yourself on these topics, then you're going to be more comfortable with it. I think what we've talked about in the Connections group is that I think what we need to do a better job at is providing sort of like a social, for lack of a better phrase, a social justice 101. Mm-hmm. That for people who've been doing the work for a while, we're like at the 300 or 400 level in the college analogy, and that people want to feel good about taking those first steps. And the base level training that we did with the staff was good. And I know that, Sergio, who's one of our English teachers here, who's one of the advisors, is having conversations with the English department that provide entry points for staff to be more comfortable with the language. But I think that's definitely an area that we could grow. And I'm betting that that's an area where more schools could do more work.
John, you have a question.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, Ted, I loved how you talked about the altruism that was kind of driving the work. And I think it shows that, you guys are living your values over at Sutton, which is really impressive. I don't know how many schools can point to specific examples of that. You were talking too, when you had 32 schools before you really had a conference model, did you sort of probably had a moment where you're like, oh, this is great, now what? So what were some of the steps that you took in order to scale it to accommodate 500 guests?
So we absolutely. So our plan was originally, when we were going to have just the Central Mass schools, well, we thought, I have a friend who's a professor at Clark. Colleen knew somebody. We thought we could get a couple of people in. Maybe our kids would present because they had done the training. They could organize a few workshops. So we had a general conference model idea for when we thought it was going to be, 30, 40 kids. And then when it blew up, then we said, okay, what are we going to do? And you'd really be amazed at what you get if you just asked. I was cold calling Clark. I cold called Bridgewater State. Bridgewater State sponsored the conference. And that was just me calling them. I was taking my son on a college tour, and I passed by the Martin Richard Institute of Social Justice. I was like, I wonder if they would come to the conference. And so when I got back on Monday, I called Martin Richard Institute of Social Justice, talked to the advisor, and she presented and sponsored the conference, sponsored the keynote speaker.
Wow.
Then I started calling Worcester State. And so we just called different people, and people were excited to be part of the work. I think that was, once we started getting a few colleges, and we could say to the next college, well, we already have a presenter from the University of Miami, University of SUNY, Old Westbury, Worcester State, Clark. I'm like, oh, okay, this is a real thing. But we definitely leaned on some personal relationships for the first couple, but then I think success breeds success, and people were willing to come. So then once we had a good number, then we felt better about how it was going to flow. And in fact, for next year, we're going to probably scale down the amount of workshops that are offered at each session to get more people into different sessions, and also allow presenters to go see each other's sessions, because that was one of the big pieces of feedback that we got from presenters. They wanted to be able to see each other's sessions. So we asked a lot of people. The funding. There was a concern early on from about like who's paying for this. Are tax dollars going to this conference? All of the funding for the conference was either a grant or donations. So that was all self-funded. And again, it was just a matter of calling Millbury Credit Union up and saying, "Hey, would you be willing to sponsor this conference?" And they said, "Absolutely," and they sent us a check. So I think just the power of asking was great to get the thing off the ground.
It's awesome. Kind of a common theme we've seen in these conversations is people who use the phrase "building the plane while you fly it." You sort of have an idea and you go for it, and it takes the drive and asking the questions and a good team, but it's pretty inspiring when you see the results.
It was. I don't think there's a point where Colleen and I were nervous, but there was definitely a, "Oh no, what do we do?" moment where it was like, "Boy, we really have a lot of people coming." And Colleen said, "Are you sure we're going to get all these people?" I'm like, "Oh, be positive." And but we did. It was only a little bit of time there. We were unsure.
Awesome.
Ted, do you envision this being something that's open to the wider community down the road? I'm curious about the community response to this type of endeavor. It seems like you've got an awful lot of support within the school community, within the kind of the business community, higher ed community, state at large. Curious about the community response, the vision for the community as a whole, and then where you see more broadly this conference heading in the future.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. We reached out to a wide range of people to come to the conference, and when I was talking to one of my friends who is a professor, he was saying, what you're doing at the school is great. This conference is great. He's like, well, what are the kids going home to? Like what's happening after they leave the doors? And that matters too. And so we invited, we sort of like an open call to members of the community. We didn't get a lot of bite. And I think some of that is like, what is this? I think some people are just put off. I mean, we're not trying to hide it. It's like, it's a social justice conference. And I think the word social justice is triggering for some folks. And so I think that some people just stayed away because they weren't sure it was for them. I think we could have done a better job maybe educating the community on what was going to be there. And I guess an example of that was after the conference, which was really well received, on a social media site, there was a community member who blasted me, blasted the conference, blasted the school. What are they doing? They're trying to indoctrinate kids, that kind of thing. The only reason why I know about this is because one of my students who was on that site copied and pasted the post and said, "Hey, you should know about this." So independently of me doing anything, the person got a lot of pushback from other people who had been to the conference or had heard from kids and said, "You're wrong. This is not the case." And the next day after, I got an email from this person apologizing to me privately. And then that person apologized on the platform. And it was because people had chimed in and said, "Hey, you know what? That's not right. That's not what happened." And that to me was the whole point of the conference. Like there was 100+ people commenting on this social media platform about the conference. They were talking about issues of social justice. One person was saying, "Boy, I don't think that's really a thing." Another person says, "Well, actually, no, I was a student there some years ago and I was Asian American. I can tell you right now, it actually was a thing." And then when I connected with the person who had the post, I was able to share a version of the story that I shared to open this podcast. And he was touched and saw why we did what we did. So that made me feel good. I think now that the conference has happened once, it was, the TNG was here, they did a story on it. We got some good feedback from that. So I think now that the conference has happened once, my hope is that when I put the invite out to the community again, we get more community members.
Yeah, it certainly seems like you have a proof of concept here, Ted. And I think it's especially telling that people are willing to jump into this public sphere and to share the truth and their power of their experience at the event. As we wrap up our time together, thanks again for so much for your time. I'm curious if you have any advice for teachers or building leaders who are either curious about getting or have this kind of inner burning to either start something oriented towards social justice, or even they have some sort of passion project themselves they want to get going. What advice would you share with them to get the ball rolling?
I think the thing that I personally, that I'll just speak for myself, the thing that I learned through this process is that if you want it to happen, you have to be intentional about dedicating the time and energy to it. As someone who believes strongly in these concepts, I've lived, or I've tried to, like when I was a teacher or when I was an administrator, support that work, but it was very passively. It was, we shouldn't do this. Yes, like trying to do the good doobie version of it. And it wasn't until the conversation with the student and how I saw it as my responsibility to make sure that kid never had that happen to him ever again. Because he's going to graduate, but there's going to be kids coming behind him. And it's my job. And so if I feel strongly, if I think it's my job, then I need to spend the time and the energy to make sure that I'm doing the best thing that I can possibly do to promote the values of what we believe in as a school. And so if it's a passion project or this, I think the dedicating time intentionally to it all the way through there's always, it's kind of a good example of don't let the urgent rule out the important.
Mm-hmm.
We always have the angry parent coming in about a grade or the teacher who did this or the kid who maybe made the best, not the best choice. And those are all the things that pop up on principals' desks all day long. But something like this is important and lasts a lot longer than that 20-minute conversation with an irate parent. So making sure that there's time dedicated to it for you and for the school. So if we believe it in as a school, we can't just say, well, it's going to be something we do with an assembly once and call it a day. Because just like we tell teachers, hey, one-stop PD is really not going to be beneficial to you. We can't tell kids that we're going to put them in a presentation about anti-bias work or about anything and expect that that's going to have a real impact. And so finding time in the schedule to dedicate it for the kids, I think was, and for yourself, I think is the only way if anything like this is going to be successful.
Fantastic insights. Thanks again so much for your time. Before I toss it back to John, just to close us out, we actually have a bonus edition of the Inspired Learning Project coming up in a couple weeks. It's a joint venture with MURSD Leads. Dr. Jal Mehta from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, author of the new book, In Search of Deeper Learning, will be joining us in 2 weeks at 4 o'clock to discuss his book. It's a great way to close out both projects to end the year. If you're watching, we also have an MURSD Leads later on this evening at 7 o'clock with Dr. Josh Eiler. We're talking about his book, In Search of Deeper Learning. But more good stuff on the way. Hope you can join us for both. And again, thanks for Ted for being here, for sharing this incredible work that you're doing. Talk about example of deeper learning in schools. I mean, this is it, right? This is what we're aiming for, big picture wise. So kudos to you, your students, and your team.
Thanks
John,
for having me.
take us home.
Yeah, thanks very much once again, Ted. Really appreciated everything you shared. If you want to reach out to Marianne, to Dave, to Maureen, or myself, or Kelly, who's in the room, and certainly to Ted for resources. I know that he's not only passionate about it, but his kids are also passionate about sharing the work that they're doing and being ambassadors of social justice. So please feel free to reach out, and we look forward to connecting with you next time in the Inspired Learning Project.